Stilton cheese is famous for not being made in the town of Stilton, which is weird because many cheeses are named after the place they are made, but not Stilton. Instead, it's made in parts of Leicestershire, Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, particularly around the town of Melton Mowbray. But why can't you make Stilton cheese in the town of Stilton? Was this always the case? Was Stilton ever made in Stilton? Hey there, cheese historians, I'm Julia and this is Cheese History, a channel where we talk about the history of cheese in all of its weird and wonderfulness. Today we're talking about Stilton cheese, the cheese that is famous for being an excellent blue cheese and not being made in the town of Stilton. This isn't because no one in Stilton makes Stilton. They aren't allowed to because Stilton is a protected cheese which can only be made in Leicestershire, Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire. And this is unusual for cheese from the UK and Europe because, by and large, they tend to be named after the areas they're made. Camembert de Normandie is made around the town of Camembert in Normandy. Brie de Meaux is made in the Brie region of France. West Country farmhouse cheddar is made in the Cheddar Gorge. Parmigiano Reggiano in the Parma Valley. Roquefort around Roquefort-sur-Sauzon, and so on. But Stilton cheese can't be made in the town of Stilton. So let's explore why that is, starting with why Stilton cheese is named after the town even though it isn't made there. Today, this town of Stilton is in the county of Cambridgeshire in England. It's located about 70 miles or 113 kilometres from London. 70 miles is roughly a day's journey by coach or on horseback. And as luck would have it, the town of Stilton is on Ermine Street, also known as the Great North Road, a long road that goes from London to Edinburgh, first built by the Romans. So back in the day, before cars and trains, if you were travelling north from London to anywhere on the Great North Road all the way up to Edinburgh, it's likely that you would be stopping in Stilton. How long you stayed would depend on how and when you were travelling. If you were travelling in the 17th century or before, you would likely be on horseback, so would stop and spend the night in Stilton. But during the late 17th and into the 18th centuries, the roads began to improve and more people started travelling by coach, so they would stop at Stilton and grab a quick bite to eat while the horses were being changed, before heading off again. Bread and cheese was a popular meal with travellers regardless of how they travelled, and the town of Stilton became known for feeding travellers excellent cheese. And this cheese was known as Stilton cheese. So at one level, Stilton cheese gets its name from the town of Stilton because it was fed to travellers travelling along the Great North Road who stopped for a meal or to stay the night and ate some local cheese during their stay. But just because Stilton was ideally situated for the cheese fed to travellers in its inns to become famous didn't mean that it had to. Gaining a reputation like this doesn't usually happen without people working to make it happen. So what's the story behind Stilton's rise to fame? And who made Stilton cheese famous? In the 1730s, a man named Cooper Thornhill bought the Bluebell Inn in Stilton. This was one of the inns on the main road through Stilton that served the travellers between London and Edinburgh. Thornhill was a trader in oats, wheat and barley, and after buying the Bluebell Inn, he began trading in Stilton cheese, which was already known to the important people in London. By 1739, he was at the top of the Stilton cheese trade. He didn't make the cheese himself though, rather he was supplied the Stilton cheese by a cheesemaker named Francis Paulet, who was, according to Stilton historian Trevor Hickman, known for producing the finest blue vein cheese that was made in England. High praise indeed. Frances Paulet is often portrayed as the star of Stilton's story. She was born in 1720 in Sproxton, Leicestershire, and taught cheesemaking by her mother. Her first husband was William Andrews, who she lived with in Wyndham making Wyndham cheese. Andrews died in 1741, and Frances married William Paulet the following year. Around this time, she went into a business deal with Cooper Thornhill to supply him with unpressed blue mold cheese. Frances was responsible for standardizing the way Stilton cheese was made. She developed a specific mold form to shape the cheese, which made a large unpressed cheese, and increased the blue mold growth by poking holes into the cheese with knitting needles as it aged. This standardization is what earns her the title of the originator of modern Stilton cheese. But this doesn't mean she was the first person to make Stilton cheese. Because of Paulet's key role in the development of modern Stilton cheese, Wyndham in Leicestershire is often seen as the place that Stilton developed, rather than the town of Stilton. But was this actually the case? Did Stilton cheese originate in Leicestershire or around Stilton in Huntingdonshire? To figure out where Stilton cheese originates, we have to look at the earliest records that mention the cheese. The earliest I could find dates to the 1710s in a novel about spies called The Northern Atlantis, or York Spy, by William King. Early in the novel, the hero eats a breakfast of a pint of canary, a pennyworth of bread, and a slice of Stilton. What's interesting here, other than the pint of canary, which is a sweet wine, for breakfast, is that King doesn't feel the need to qualify Stilton with cheese. He expects his readers to know what Stilton is. There were also two other writers writing a few years later in the 1720s who mentioned Stilton, Daniel Defoe and William Stukeley. In 1722, Stukeley wrote in Itinerarium Curiosum that Stilton is famous for its cheese, which would be thought equal to Parmesan were it not too near us. Defoe also mentions this fame of Stilton cheese as he passes through the town of Stilton and compares it to Parmesan in his tour through England and Wales, which was published in several volumes in the 1720s. From these early mentions, we can deduce that Stilton was well known for its cheese by the 1720s and was favourably compared to Parmesan. This comparison with Parmesan doesn't mean that 1720s Stilton was a hard-aged cheese like Parmesan is. In the early 1730s, Richard Bradley described Stilton as so soft one may spread it upon bread like butter. So Stilton was a cheese known for its quality, just like Parmesan was. And Bradley's description of Stilton sounds a lot like Stilton today, which is known for being a soft, creamy cheese. So Stilton had a reputation already in the early 18th century, likely earned by being fed to travellers on the Great North Road. But the real question here is, was Stilton being made in Stilton? I think all the evidence points to it being made in Stilton at this time, rather than in Leicestershire, because these early references to Stilton cheese connect it with the town itself. Several of these writers mention Stilton being famous for its cheese before the typical origin story for Stilton cheese. Thornhill didn't purchase the Bluebell Inn until the 1730s, and Francis Paulet wasn't born until 1720. King published his novel in the 1710s, Defoe and Stukeley in the 1720s, and Bradley in the 1730s. So Stilton was well known before Thornhill and Paulet arrived on the scene. But that doesn't have to mean that cheese stoled in Stilton was made there, does it? No, it doesn't. In fact, Bradley mentions that he's eaten cheese made with the Stilton recipe near Nottingham, but it's clear that he sees this as different from Stilton cheese, even though they are so similar. In a later work, he also chides the people of Stilton for not keeping up with the ancient way of making the cheese, further suggesting that Stilton cheese was being made in Stilton in the early 18th century. He also mentions that the owner of the Bluebell Inn provided him with excellent cheese. As Bradley published this work around 1727, this was before Cooper Thornhill's ownership of the Bluebell. The evidence for Stilton cheese originally being made in Stilton was enough that even the Stilton Cheesemakers Association now mentions it on their website. Cream cheese was being made and sold in and around the village of Stilton, possibly in the late 17th century and certainly in the early 18th century, and this was known as Stilton cheese. So, if there's all this evidence that Stilton cheese was being made in Stilton, why did it stop being made in Stilton? A number of factors contributed to the centre of Stilton cheesemaking moving away from Stilton to Leicestershire, particularly around the town of Melton Mowbray. The first is that the beginning of the 19th century was the golden era for the coaching trade in Stilton, as the Great North Road grew in popularity with travellers and goods. The fens, which are a type of wetland to the east of the village, were drained for grazing the horses that pulled the coaches, and sheep and cattle were fattened up for market in London. By this time, thanks to the partnership between Cooper Thornhill and Francis Paulet in the 18th century, Stilton cheese was being made in Leicestershire and shipped to Stilton for sale at the Bluebell Inn. Other inns in the village had followed suit during the late 1700s, and Stilton cheesemaking in Leicestershire had grown. As the innkeepers of Stilton could source their cheese from outside the town, the people of the village were able to focus on the coaching trade rather than making cheese. So slowly, over many years, cheesemaking in Stilton declined and was replaced by the various industries needed to support the travellers and goods that passed through the town. In the early 1840s, the cheese trade from Stilton collapsed. Why? Because the Midland and Great Northern Railway lines were completed, connecting London to Peterborough, ending the long-distance stagecoach business for Stilton. Now, cheesemakers in Melton Mowbray could ship their cheese directly to London and didn't need the middlemen in Stilton. Melton Mowbray held the first Stilton Cheese Fair in September 1883, officially becoming the centre of Stilton cheesemaking. So because of the success of the coaching trade in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the town of Stilton moved away from cheesemaking and focused instead on serving the coaching trade. As Stilton cheese was already being made in Leicestershire, the innkeepers simply bought the cheese from there and shipped it in as part of the goods trade through Stilton. But this reliance on the coaching trade backfired with the arrival of the railway, and by then Stilton couldn't even fall back on its famous cheese because it was now being mostly made in Leicestershire, particularly around Melton Mowbray, and not Stilton. But that wasn't the only bump in the road for Stilton cheese. In 1940, Stilton cheesemaking was banned throughout the entire United Kingdom. The Second World War was in full swing, and the British government only allowed the production of cheddar cheese. Cheeses like Stilton were seen as luxury items, and all the labour and milk used for making them was instead put towards the more utilitarian cheddar. Many Stilton cheesemakers closed up shop for good because they couldn't convert to making cheddar because they didn't have the equipment to press the cheese. It wasn't until 1947 that Stilton cheesemaking started up again. This gap wasn't very long, but it was long enough that some of the institutional knowledge of Stilton cheesemaking was lost, and it reduced the number of dairies set up to make the cheese. Today, Stilton is only made in 5 different dairies scattered throughout Leicestershire, Derbyshire, and Nottinghamshire. Several of these dairies have pedigrees that go back to the mid-19th century. So has Stilton cheese changed in that time? To understand how Stilton has changed, first we have to know what it is like and how it's made today. The exact details vary, but this is how the product specification for Stilton cheese describes the process. The milk is then pasteurized and pumped into vats where a starter culture and coagulant, animal rennet or non-animal rennet, are added. The milk forms curds which are cut with knives to help release the whey. The following day the curd is cut into small blocks, milled into walnut-sized pieces and salted, then tipped into cylindrical cheese molds. In addition to the starter culture, a blue mold, Penicillium roqueforti, is added to the milk and/or sprayed onto the curds in order to generate the blue veins. The cheeses are then drained for 7 days and aged for 6 weeks, when they are pierced with skewers to let oxygen into the cheese to encourage the blue mold to grow and form veins throughout the cheese. This means that Stilton is an unpressed cheese. At no point in the process is weight applied to the cheese to press some of the liquid whey out of the curds. So broadly speaking, that's how Stilton cheese is made today. But is it the same as in the 18th and 19th centuries? Richard Bradley, who mentioned Stilton early in the 1730s, also published the earliest recipe for Stilton cheese in his general treatise of husbandry and gardening. It was made from a mix of milk and cream with rennet added and the resulting curds broken into tiny pieces before being pressed. Interestingly, the cheese is then put into boiling whey for an hour before being wrapped in linen and aged. So assuming that Bradley's description of Stilton cheesemaking is accurate, and I for one would have liked him to go into way more detail, but assuming it's accurate, then it differs from modern Stilton in several ways. The curds are pressed with weight to form them into a wheel of cheese, whereas today they let settle under their own weight. And the formed cheese is boiled in whey and pressed for a second time, something that's not done now. So Stilton cheese today isn't the same as it was in the 1720s, and some of those changes are likely down to cheesemakers like Frances Paulet, who's credited with poking holes in the cheese with knitting needles to encourage the blue mold growth. Unfortunately, we don't have any written records of her recipe, so it's hard to say exactly what changes she made to the process of making Stilton and what has changed since. Somewhere along the way the cheese was no longer pressed and boiled, and that could have been Frances, but it also could have been somebody else. We do know that by the end of the 19th century, Stilton cheese was no longer being pressed or boiled. John Monk described Stilton cheesemaking briefly in 1794, and it's still being pressed but not boiled. G. Kemp provides a thorough account of Stilton cheesemaking in 1889, and he states that, except for a wooden follower, which is a flat form put on top of the cheese while in the mould, as a rule no other weight should be used, though sometimes it is necessary to do so. He cautions that applying weight requires a lot of experience. So the recipe has changed since Bradley's early 18th century account. Throughout the 20th century, Stilton cheesemaking underwent a number of other changes too. In the 1970s, cheesemakers started adding blue mold cultures. Up until this point, the blue mold had taken up residence in the cheese from the cheesemaking or aging environment. But by the 70s, scientists had isolated the specific strains of Penicillium roqueforti and made them commercially available. So it made sense for cheesemakers to start adding them at the start of the process rather than leaving whether they got the right mold growing up to chance. Another big change was pasteurizing the milk. Back in the 18th century, no milk was pasteurized because pasteurizing milk didn't become a regular thing until the 20th century. In Britain, pasteurization of milk for drinking wasn't law until 1949. But the requirements for making Stilton cheese today is that the milk must be pasteurized. The change was made in 1989 when the Minister of Agriculture announced that making cheese with unpasteurized milk in factories would be banned. So the Stilton Cheesemakers Association, which was formed in 1936, changed to only using pasteurized milk. This is another change from what Stilton would have been like in Frances Paulet's day in the 18th century. So the move to pasteurized milk means that if you follow all the rules for Stilton, but use raw milk, you won't be able to call the cheese Stilton. But does anyone try to make Stilton without following the rules? All the rules around pasteurization caused a problem for some die-hard Stilton fans who wanted the raw milk Stilton experience. One of these fans was raw milk cheesemaker Joe Schneider, who set out to make Stilton with raw milk, following the same process as earlier handmade Stilton production. But because he was using raw milk, he couldn't call the cheese Stilton cheese. Instead, he gave his cheese a new name, Stichelton. Stichelton is the Old English name for the town of Stilton, and we saw it earlier in the video in the excerpt from William Stuckley. Schneider, along with business partner Randolph Hodgson, set up the Stichelton Dairy in 2006, and have been making Stichelton with raw milk ever since. Personally, I think that naming your cheese after the original name of the town that you can't name your cheese after for legal reasons is quite a flex. Schneider isn't alone in wanting to make Stilton cheese that doesn't meet the PDO rules. There's also a movement in the town of Stilton to revive its cheesemaking. In 2011, the current owner of the Bell Inn, Liam McGivern, with support from local historian Richard Landy, whose research into Stilton cheese was very helpful for this video, announced that he was intending to start producing Stilton cheese in the town. Of course, due to the PDO restrictions, he also can't call it Stilton cheese, and he's been trying ever since to get the Stilton Cheesemakers Association to amend the rules so Stilton cheese can be made in Stilton once again. But as far as I can tell, he hasn't had any luck with that yet. I also couldn't find out whether he's managed to bring his Bell's Blue from Stilton to market yet. We have covered a lot of ground in this video, because the history of Stilton is a little bit chaotic. So let's sum it up. Stilton cheese got its name because it was made in the town of Stilton, which became a really popular stopping point on the road between Edinburgh and London, and fed really good cheese to those who stopped at its inns. It was famous by the early 1700s, and ended up being so popular that, by the 1740s, its production was outsourced to Leicestershire to keep up with demand. Cheesemaker Francis Paulet had a hand in standardizing the way Stilton was made, and eventually Stilton stopped being made in Stilton because the coaching trade had grown so much that they put all their energy into that and shipped their cheese in from Leicestershire. However, this had the unintended side effect that when the railways replaced the Great North Road, Stilton was left without a coaching trade and without its signature cheese, by then firmly established in Leicestershire and the surrounding counties. Only in the last decade is Stilton trying to reclaim its cheese, even though it hasn't had any success so far. As for the cheese itself, it's changed a lot over the last 300 years, if the early recipes are anything to go by, and has even changed in the last 100 years, particularly going from a raw milk cheese to a pasteurized milk cheese. Thanks for watching. I realized this wasn't a short video by any means. The history of Stilton cheese turned out to be pretty complex, and it took me ages to filter through all the various sources and accounts to put this video together. I think this is probably my most complex video to date, at least in terms of how long it took me to put together all the pieces in a way that I was happy with. So if you enjoyed this video, please support the channel by liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and leave a comment below. It doesn't cost you anything other than a few more moments of your time, and it helps me a lot. You can also support me over on Patreon, where I have a new behind-the-scenes short podcast about the stuff that doesn't make it into these videos, and the topics I'm currently researching. I've recorded an episode that covers some of the details of the history of Stilton that didn't make it into this video. But that's enough for today, so I'll see you next time for more cheese history.